if I could welcome towards the front Peter Mason and Dr. Nathan Pike, and I will do the introduction. So this final session of presentations that we have arranged is about collaboration, regulation, and technology transfer. What do we think might be coming up for us researchers practically trying to do international high-quality research? Helen, I'm going to be very cheeky and ask if you would mind if I read out the questions you posed, because I think they fitted this session particularly well. Bear with me, it's quite a comprehensive set of comments and questions. So Helen leads a portfolio of cancer clinical trials, and there's uncertainty over what regulations are going to follow in future in the light of Brexit. It makes it difficult to plan new work, especially if we're trying to collaborate with other EU countries. So here come a set of 6 or 7 questions. We are reliant on collaborations with various pharmaceutical companies. Will they now take strategic decisions not to invest in research in the UK? We run a number of trials using radioisotopes for diagnosis or treatment. Will we still be able to access these, obtain them, and use them in the trials? How about the experimental drugs that are being manufactured in other countries? Will there be additional barriers to import them and get them tested here? The Department of Oncology is a mix of many different nationalities. Just sitting, having lunch and tea, you hear a mixture of different accents. Will the impact on the department be lessened if the UK is no longer such an attractive place to study and work? So its EU students and staff are invaluable to the work that Helen is doing. When a new treatment has been through trials and found to be successful, will patients in the UK actually be able to benefit and do so promptly? Or will there be separate medicine licensing agreements from the rest of the EU, which could be a barrier for us? And that's notwithstanding the issues we've already mentioned on ongoing austerity and the difficulties of recruiting staff to the NHS. So quite a lot in there. I'm not expecting our speakers to answer all of those by far. They're probably horrified by the fact that I've read that out now. But no, what I would say is these are all very pertinent questions that many researchers are asking. And as we've already said, there's only so much that we can know at this point. However, as you've seen, the second half of the day is involved inviting more external speakers to give us their experience of interacting with others, whether it's politicians in Europe and Parliament, or whether it's like the work that Peter and Nathan are doing, meeting other people from other universities. So what are some of the external perspectives on what's going on? So first up, I'm very happy to welcome Peter Mason here from Universities UK International. He is a policy manager, and the organisation itself represents UK vice-chancellors. He leads on policy and advocacy work on the EU and international research collaborations, including responses to Brexit, and hopefully shaping the future of UK-EU relationships in science and innovation. So, very welcome, please come and join us here.
Is that? Oh, great, thank you. Lovely. Let's try and start this. Okay, well, I think just firstly, following the previous interventions, I might just preface my comments by observing that I think what I'm going to say here is based more in the circumstances that we find ourselves at the moment. I mean, as you'll be aware, Universities UK led a very fiercely pro-Remain campaign during the referendum, but I think the decision was taken after that, coincidentally before I arrived here, to kind of accept the outcome and try and work within those parameters. But I mean, I'm sure there'd be no one more pleased than us if what Mr. Hutton outlined were to come to pass. But in any case, thank you for the invitation today. It's very welcome to have the opportunity to speak to active researchers and to hear your views on the impact of Brexit on your work. As Anjali mentioned, I work at University UK International, which is the international arm of Universities UK, and I work mostly on the framework programs and UK participation in Horizon 2020 and the next iteration of that program, but also on related issues such as EU regulation, which is going to be the focus of what I'm going to talk about today. But before I can go on to regulation, I just wanted to kind of take some time to share with you some of the initial key lines that we've developed on international collaboration more broadly, in addition to what we currently enjoy through the framework programs, feeding into the International Research and Innovation Strategy, which BEIS and UK Research and Innovation are currently developing and plan to launch at the same time as UKRI in April. These are the result of a piece of qualitative research that we commissioned last year, interviewing a range of research policy, research directors and funders to understand what they see as the kind of facilitating factors and some of the barriers to international collaboration. And so these kind of 5 messages are, as I say, the key lines that we're hoping to kind of put into BEIS and UKRI as they develop that strategy. So any thoughts that you have on these would be welcome. So I mean, the first one is that it is vital for funders to both support researchers, especially early career researchers, to forge new international links and to enhance support for established collaborations. There's also a clear demand for more funding for researcher mobility, both inbound and outbound, for different kind of lengths of time. There should be no undue concentration of funding for international collaboration in country or topic-specific funding schemes, and instead there should be taking into account the diversity of partners that UK researchers have and the different themes that they work on, flexibility around the objectives and modalities for any additional support that comes online. And finally, as you might expect from University UK, we're very keen to promote the role of institutions in building those partnerships, both in facilitating researchers at institutions to make the most of international collaboration and to establish kind of institution-level partnerships as well. But clearly, regulation is obviously also essential for facilitating international collaboration. And much as I'd like to kind of reassure you about the potential impact of Brexit on that front, I think given the lack of vision that we currently have from the government, although I did write this after last night's developments at Chequers, whatever they are, I think at the moment we clearly have very little sense of direction of what that final destination may be. So today what I'm going to try and do is give you some outline of what we see as what Universities UK see as the most important kind of principles and characteristics, firstly, of an effective regulatory regime for research and innovation. Some of the benefits and risks to different overall approaches that the government could take to regulation, and some key areas where we think that continuity is absolutely vital in the short to medium term following March next year or the subsequent transition implementation period. So starting with the kind of principles and characteristics that we think are important for that regime. I mean, I've got 3 kind of suggestions here, which again, I very much welcome your views on, for what should the government be thinking about when thinking about the way that regulation affects research and innovation in universities. The first one is that any regulatory regime, should be responsive and proportionate. So welcoming the new and kind of unprecedented approaches and discoveries that research and innovation activity can lead to, regulation has a very important role to play to make sure that those are captured in a way that is not only safe but also kind of ethically sound and acceptable for society. So regulatory decision making needs to be science-led and proportionate to the risk implied, and also engage the public to make sure that there's some kind of contract there. Secondly, regulation needs to facilitate cross-border collaboration. As we said before, international collaboration is central to the success of UK higher education research. And that's evident not just through call for publications, but also through research and innovation practice and activity, and especially things like cross-border clinical trials, which are essential in fields where there's very small patient cohorts, which make national trials impossible. Compliance with certain kind of EU standards is also essential for participation in the framework programs, and presumably in the future iterations of the framework programs. And then thirdly, interdependence. Regulatory regimes need to kind of take note of the disparate impacts that discoveries in a certain field can have across a wide range of different policy areas. One example that I refer to often is the field of animals containing human material. So where human DNA is introduced into DNA sequences introduced into animals, or mixing of human and animal cells or tissues. The Home Office produced guidance on this topic a couple of years ago, and it cuts across 3 different legal acts. I won't list them, but anyway, you can take my word for it, and some of those incorporating EU directives themselves. So in that way, I think there needs to be a whole system approach to regulation that takes note of the different departments and agencies and policy areas which can be impacted by separate discoveries. In taking into account these kind of preferable characteristics and principles, how should the government look to amend or not regulation as we leave the EU? Obviously, the most radical option on the table is ripping it apart and starting again, creating a system of complete regulatory divergence, developing our own models from scratch, which might allow for us to retain to build things that are responsive and proportionate and interdependent, but definitely wouldn't allow for that facilitation of cross-border facilitation. And for that reason, I think is something that we'd be very clear that we wouldn't be encouraging the government to pursue. At the other end of the spectrum, the government could opt to keep all existing EU legislation and continue to update them on an ongoing basis to ensure continued compliance with all of the almost daily changes which come from the European Commission through the whole comitology process. This would reverse that equation where you would have very easily, would facilitate cross-border collaboration very well, but could miss any opportunities that might be available to create more responsible, proportionate regulations, and would also leave the UK exposed to any changes that might not be in the national interest, given that there won't be a seat at the table for the UK after March next year. So I think taking into account those 2 extremes and considering that what the government has currently got on the table in the EU withdrawal bill is essentially continuing with existing EU legislation, at least in the short to medium term, we'd suggest that they kind of avoid both of those extremes and kind of aim for a trajectory where on a case-by-case basis over the medium to long term, different fields of regulation are explored to identify where there might be risks and disadvantages to diverging or to continuing to maintain alignment or harmonisation even with EU rules. I think what is essential through all of this is that regulatory changes can't be rushed through, and that any changes need to be undertaken with complete and thorough consultation with research and innovation stakeholders and researchers themselves to make sure that there are no unforeseen and detrimental consequences to any changes that happen. So, notwithstanding that approach, I think that there are clearly, through talking to the science and research community stakeholders in the academies and other funders, I think there's a clear consensus that there are a few areas where actually continued harmonisation with EU standards is absolutely essential for the kind of well-being of the sector in the short to medium term. Firstly, I think the government has to ensure that there's no impact on UK researchers on their ability to continue to exchange personal data with EU counterparts. So that means continuing to make sure that the GDPR is implemented and not kind of derivating from that path to try and ensure that post, as I say, either March 19 or the implementation period, there is this adequacy status for the UK data protection regime. Secondly, although it's only due to come into force in 2019, we think the government needs to make sure that they ensure compliance with the clinical trials regulations that have been updated and ensure access to the clinical trials portal. It's vital to avoid short-term destabilization to medical and pharmacological research, but wouldn't be covered as it stands by the withdrawal bill, given that it's entering into force after we've left. And thirdly, the government needs to ensure continued access to the EU chemicals database in compliance with REACH regulations. So I hope that's useful to have that outline of the University UK view of the implications of Brexit in this area, and I very much welcome your thoughts on both these impacts and on the principles for international collaboration, or perhaps after the other speaker.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
And the last of our speakers for the meeting, although we do have the panel discussion coming up later, I'm very pleased to invite Dr. Nathan Pike, who's the Director of Training and Higher Education at Accenture. Nathan is originally a biological scientist and has worked in Oxford's zoology department in the past. He's got broad interests in higher education in the international context and has particular interest in delivering effective training and development to support institutions. So it's all about fostering innovation and entrepreneurship. So I will let Nathan give us the final talk. Thank you. This one is there. Yeah, you don't need this thing. I'll use it. Okay.
Can you get me started? I can use this one here.
Yeah. Would you like me to stay here and click to the next one, or you can?
No, I've got, with the clicker it would be fine as long as it opens. There we go. Good. Where's F5?
It's there, yeah.
No, it's there.
Yeah, just use that button.
Hello everyone. I think I might be here as a distraction. I hope it will be a slightly pleasant distraction, but I'll tell you a bit about Accenture. And I should say that I'd be surprised if anyone knew what Accenture is, because we haven't been around for very long. But we are part of the universities and indeed of Oxford's innovation ecosystem. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about our place. And I hope I'm also going to give you a bit of a pragmatic view on what we have done since Brexit had been decided. So talk a little bit usefully about this thing that is now being called knowledge exchange and commercialization, but you might be more familiar with it under its old title of technology transfer. So a bit about Accenture, a bit about what we do, a bit about hopefully how we might help you in your European collaborations and indeed outside of Europe. And then also a few thoughts on what might happen to critical innovation infrastructures in the post-Brexit world, and also a little bit more about intellectual property rights and how those rights might change after Brexit has actually happened. I have to add, though, I'm not alone. I've got my colleague Tim Hart here in the presentation as well, so if you would like to talk to anyone about the sorts of issues that I discuss over the next 10 minutes, I don't anticipate taking up 15, then Tim at the back of the room is also here. Please feel free to speak to either one of us. The other thing I need to say is that we used to be part of something that you might have heard of, which is Oxford University Innovation. So that was the technology transfer company of the University of Oxford, which recently rebranded also. It used to be called ISIS Innovation. It didn't like being conflated with a terrorist organization, even though, of course, it was named after the river, and it rebranded to OUI, Oxford University Innovation. We are Accenture, and this close relationship with our mother company, OUI, is born out of the fact that ISIS OUI was around for just over 30 years now, whereas we were established in 2004 to do for the rest of the world what ISIS did for the university. So OUI, Oxford University Innovation, is very much internal facing, looking to look after you as you produce intellectual property that you would like to see commercialized all around the world, including Europe. And I'll touch on European patents in just a moment. Whereas for the most part, ISIS Enterprise, now called Oxentia, was set up to respond to queries from those outside Oxford who are looking at first to emulate Oxford, but then to tap into our experience on how you might do knowledge commercialization in a number of different jurisdictions, including Europe. Okay, well, I don't know if I need to burden you too much with that, Guff, but basically, we help to commercialize good ideas, we help to set up businesses, and we don't subscribe to the view that this is something that is somehow magical. We assist people who are either have a widget and would like to license it to the highest bidder, or alternatively, they're looking to set up a company. We also help universities all around the world, and I'll touch on some in just a moment, in Europe, to do this thing that is technology transfer. We do it through training people, and that's the bit that I tend to lead on. We do it through actually commercializing technologies. We do it through helping people to understand their innovation ecosystems, like the Oxford Innovation Ecosystem, so they can tap into it better. And we help them by actually setting up systems for themselves. And I'll give you some examples of those, just so you think of us fondly in the future, should those sorts of situations arise for you. We've worked in lots of places, and you can see that over the last 12 months, if it's blue, we've worked there. So we've worked in some European nations recently, and we can always draw on those experiences if that's of interest. Where we have a pin, we have a member of staff. So we do have an international outlook, and it's not going to come as a surprise to anyone in this room that there are very few of us in the Oxentia offices who obviously voted for Brexit. The sorts of things that we have been doing recently, which gives us an outlook that might help Tim and I to start to answer some of the questions that you might have for the panel discussion. Working with the University of Warsaw, and this is actually an initiative that came through from Ian Walmsley, who spoke earlier, helping with a quantum computing, quantum development laboratory that's happening out of the University of Warsaw. In Turin, in Italy, we're working with the Links Foundation to set up a technology transfer office, somewhat like Oxford University Innovation. In Lithuania, we're doing something similar with regard to training in entrepreneurship for a number of academics who are based in the Center for Physical Sciences and Technology. In Galicia, in the north of Spain, Fundación Barrié, it works particularly in supporting the Galician region to commercialize great ideas. This is a bank, and it's located in another part of Europe, which is undergoing some funny changes. That's Catalonia. La Caixa has recently relocated from Catalonia to Madrid with a view to continuing to support commercialization outside of what is Catalonia. There might be some parallels there that we could ultimately talk about. Tim is the key person in working in France, in the Paris region, in Ile-de-France, EDF Innov. We're basically undertaking a lot of technology transfer for our colleagues there in France, and with other satellite hubs that do innovation as part of the broader French network. We set up an incubator for the University of Leiden, and obviously earlier, Alistair was talking about the fact that it seems like we've lost one of our medicines agencies to Rotterdam, to the Netherlands, and to the Leiden area. But we do have this big perspective, and we're working with PricewaterhouseCoopers to set up a number of digital hubs for smart factories across Eastern Europe, and those countries are highlighted behind me. I won't dwell on that now because it's only going to be of interest to a few people, I dare say. By way of example, just so that it's not quite such a whirlwind tour, I'll mention that we've worked with another European nation, a European nation that was very close to what we did when we recently had our Brexit vote, but it tipped the other way. The University of Malta Malta just decided to join the European Union. There were many people who really were not in favour. They are now in Europe, for better or for worse, and we were lucky to access some European structural funding to help them to set up a technology transfer unit within their flagship university, which is the University of Malta. We did lots of nice things, and they have lots of nice training rooms too, as we do here today. I won't burden you with that, I don't think. I promised before finishing this whirlwind presentation to talk a little bit more about implications, particularly with regard to intellectual property and protection of intellectual property. And obviously, our university is a powerhouse in the production of intellectual property. We've got many spin-outs every year, as well as many license deals, and start to talk about what that's going to mean for the infrastructure that's, to a large extent, does support the production of this intellectual property. I'm sorry, it's not very clear, but on the backdrop to this slide is, of course, the Diamond Light Source accelerator, photon accelerator, which is located in the Harwell campus. This is obviously a multi-billion enterprise piece of infrastructure, which in large part has been funded by the European Union. Another example is this joint European torus, which investigates the feasibility of fusion energy for producing almost unlimited amounts of clean energy, which is located in Culham, all part, as we all are, of the Oxfordshire innovation ecosystem, all of which are quite heavily dependent on European research funding. I just thought, in case you weren't aware, we keep a close eye on these things because we like to do business in Europe. We like to collaborate in Europe, and we like to support colleagues, both within the University of Oxford and without, in their European activities. So this is a report that came across our radar very recently, a couple of weeks ago. If you're not familiar with it, you'll obviously have access to this presentation. But the Royal Society surveyed 135 research infrastructures. Those were defined by institutions which at some point had received either UK government or European funding. And the European Union has actually funded 84% of those. 31% of those 135 research infrastructures described EU funding as essential, and a further 46% said it was important. Well, now I've added to the depressive tone of the day, so you'll have to forgive me for that, but it's something that we're up against and something of which we're very cognizant, of course. What about intellectual property rights, which is our core matter, our bread and butter? What is likely to happen if indeed we do find ourselves in a situation of, say, in around 3 years' time of having Brexited? Well, what about patents? And that's what people mostly think about when we're thinking about intellectual property and IPRs, intellectual property rights, and finding the necessary protections. Happily, the European Patent Convention, and indeed the European Patent Office and membership of the European Patent Office, are entirely independent of being within the EU. So from what we can ascertain at the current stage, there will be no change with regard to obtaining patent protection via the European Patent Office. That means that filing patents and prosecuting and obtaining patents via either the European Patent Office or something which is closer to an international route to obtaining patents called the Patent Cooperation Treaty, is likely to be quite unaffected by Brexit, which is good news. Some of you will be aware that there has been discussion for a very long time, and it has recently come to likely imminent fruition of a unitary patent, which at the moment, the way it works, if you want to have a patent, you can apply via either the EPO route or the PCT route, and when it comes time to formally get the patent, you need to apply independently in each country of Europe. The UK has recently signed up to the Unitary Patent Agreement, which means that you can apply for one patent which will give you coverage in all European nations. We're still very hopeful that UK will participate in the European Unitary Patent System, which, as I say, is about to come to fruition. And unlike the Medicines Agency, it looks almost certain that the London seat of the Unified Patent Court is likely to remain. And there will, of course, be another in Germany and another in France. When it comes to EU trademark and design registrations, the outlook is probably less rosy. Once the UK has decided to leave, there may be a transition period, but at some point it will probably be necessary to seek trademark and registered design protections, both independently here in the UK and in Europe, in whatever guise that might appear. That's all I have to say. I'd be happy to take some questions. I'm sure Tim would be happy in joining me with that too, but thank you for your kind attention.
Okay, so any questions on this particular area? Concerns? Yes, Mike.
The timing for the unitary patent, what's that looking like at the moment? The timing for the unitary patent, what is that looking like at the moment?
It's anyone's guess. And actually, not every European Union country is going to subscribe to the unitary patent. For example, countries which are part of, Spain and Croatia, which are part of the European Union, are not subscribing to the unitary patent. There are other countries like Norway, which are part of an area, but not part of the European Union, which will probably also abstain. There are a number of countries which are likely to sign up soon, but it's anyone's guess, and it goes back to Europe from what I can tell. So maybe next year would be the best guess that I have. Tim, good guess?
Things get disrupted and priorities and agendas change because of other issues, such as the Brexit process itself, but
Yeah.
it's going to happen. But when exactly?
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, Jill?
Patents again, sorry.
Lovely, John, yeah.
Thanks for water, by the way. In terms of saying that the whole thing around patents is outside the EU, and it's a kind of intergovernmental thing rather than a... So was Euratom? You know, in that sense that and yet, unbeknownst to almost, well, to anybody, it was randomly decided that actually there was a problem with that and we were out. You sound very confident that once they've realised, potentially, jurisdiction of European Court of Justice on some of this patent stuff, maybe. I just hope for your sake that when they suddenly notice that there is this thing, that actually there may be some red lines, do you think? Is that possible, or has it all been sorted?
So I'm not a patent lawyer. I'm a biologist by training who's since moved into HE consultancy, I guess. So, my background is really that I taught biology. But I have some understanding of this, and I'll answer in this from this ill-educated frame of mind. And it's not just about the European Court of Justice, from my understanding, but there are also patent courts, and ultimately there will be a European patent court which will decide on these important matters. I guess my more pragmatic answer to this, which obviously the world isn't always logical, and we have a documented history of acting in slightly irrational ways. But if financial rationality does tend to continue to take the fore, as it has up until now, then it would make sense for solid pecuniary reasons for the UK to remain firmly subscribed to these agreements, so that protections that are in place today remain in place for the future, so that the UK can continue to bank the protections that are afforded to it via the monopolies associated with things like patent protection or registered designs or trademarks. So I think it's a fairly safe bet that, certainly at least from our side, the UK side, will do everything we can to remain part of that agreement.